you need to start using Midjourney text weights today. Not only are you probably building all your prompts wrong, you're also missing out on tons of creativity, and most importantly, control. So there's a couple of things that we want to learn today. First of all, we want to understand the importance of prompt structure. We also want to understand why subtle differences in your prompts can have massive consequences. And finally, of course, we want to learn how to use text weights in our prompts. So let's start off with one of the most common misconceptions about Midjourney. It's the fact that a lot of people believe that you structure your prompt with the use of commas into different partial concepts. Now that seems very logical, however, it's simply not true, and I'm going to prove it to you. So let's take a look at a very basic example. I'm going to start off by entering the imagine command, followed by house, comma, red. Now you may have noticed that I've also added the seed parameter at the end here with the seed value of 1. If you're not familiar with this particular parameter, I do recommend that you check out my dedicated video on how to use the seed. But in very basic and simple terms, what it does is it allows me to reduce the randomness of the results that I will get from Midjourney. And it's basically very, very helpful if I want to compare different prompts to each other and maintain a certain seed value, which ensures that also the rough composition will stay the same. But let's start off by having a look at what this prompt actually gives us. Okay, and here we go. We've gotten exactly what we would expect from this prompt, house red. So what do we get? Let's have a closer look. We get 4 houses that are red, and there's a lot more red in the background and stuff like that. So let's have a look at what happens if we enter this very same prompt, but we remove the comma. I'm still going to use a seed of 1. Okay, and here's the second image. Let's have a quick look at what the image looks like. Again, we get 4 red houses. In this particular case here, we've also got some red in the grass over here as well. But basically, these two prompts are more or less giving us the same type of output image. Now, you might think that in this particular case, it's mainly because the words are so short and it's just, it's just one word plus another one. And yeah, of course, it's going to be roughly the same. But let me show you another example and you'll see that it's actually not because it's just a couple of short words. So this time I'm going to use something slightly stranger. I'm going to start off by saying, imagine a skyscraper on top of a barn. Again, with a seed of 1. Okay, so let's open up this one and have a quick look. I honestly did not know what to expect because obviously these two concepts don't really fit together. But basically what Midjourney seems to have tried to do is it's tried to put a skyscraper on top of a barn, or it's sort of shaped the top of a barn like a skyscraper. I'm really not entirely sure what it's tried to do, but just keep these pictures in mind. And what we'll do now is we're going to change up the prompt and start off with on top of a barn, comma, skyscraper. And now you would maybe expect that it would give us something completely different, but actually it doesn't. As you can see, these images, even though yes, there's a slight difference in color up here on the right and the top left, but essentially it's more or less understood exactly the same thing. And that's because Midjourney doesn't really pay a lot of attention to punctuation or to sentence structure. It's simply trying to interpret the prompt as a text as best as it can. And in this case, these two prompts look more or less the same to Midjourney. Based on my personal experience, it simply ignores most commas, even though most people think it actually doesn't. So as a basic rule of thumb, a prompt that looks a little bit like this, imagine keyword 1, comma, keyword 2, comma, keyword 3, is roughly the same as saying imagine keyword 1, keyword 2, and keyword 3. Of course, there will be slight differences here or there, but this is more or less how it works. So you might be wondering, what exactly does all of this have to do with text weights? Well, text weights allow us to give a different weighting to different parts of our prompt. In other words, if a particular part of your prompt is more important than another one, for example, in this case, keyword 2 might be more important than keyword 1 and keyword 3, then you can use these weights to communicate to Midjourney that it should put more emphasis on that part and less on another part. And one of the biggest misconceptions is that a lot of people actually believe that using commas splits up the prompt into the same type of blocks and chunks with a weighting of 1 as if you were actually using weights in the first place. So for example, a lot of people will structure the prompts like this. Imagine keyword 1, comma, keyword 2, comma, keyword 3. And they believe it's roughly the same thing as writing this. Imagine keyword 1 followed by 2 colons and the weighting of 1, and then repeating the same thing for keywords 2 and keywords 3. So what you're seeing here is a weighting of 1 being applied to every single keyword. If you wanted to change the weighting of one of these keywords, you would simply change the number 1 and add a 2 or a 3 or whatever you want to do. But believing that these two things are the same is absolute rubbish. So what's going on here? Well, in the first example, the prompt is setting 3 different keywords, but it's telling Midjourney to interpret them as a single concept. Weights are completely irrelevant in this case because it's a single concept and it has a weighting of, 1. In the second example, we're using the very same 3 keywords and we're assigning a weighting to each one of them. However, each keyword is treated as its own single concept in itself. And then these 3 are put together in Midjourney. So this might look like a very subtle difference in the actual prompt itself. But if you look at the results that you get, the difference is massive. So let's have another look at the example from earlier, the very first one with the house and red prompt. Keep these images in mind because what we're going to do now is we're going to enter the very same prompt, but this time we're going to add a weighting of 1 to the house and a weighting of 1 to red. And let me just add the seed to maintain things and let's see what happens. Okay, so let me just quickly open up the old one so we have it side by side, and we're also going to open up this new set of images as a comparison. So this is what we got with our first prompt, where we just used house, red, and it understood the concept as a red house, and that's what we got. But the background, there's nothing very special about it. It's a relatively plain house. If we look at the other image with the weights, what you'll notice is that the results are considerably more creative. So there's a lot more interpretation going on. Here you've got water on the floor, here you've got some rocks. This is a very, very, very red image. And this is the type of thing you'll see every time you use text weights. By the way, if you do not add a value to your text weights and just use the double colon, then it's the same thing as if you had added a value of 1. So the absence of a value essentially equates to 1. Okay, so this is already pretty good, but the fun really starts once you start playing around with the different weights. So let me quickly close down these images. And this time we're going to enter the prompt, imagine house with a weighting of 1 and red with a weighting of 2 and seed of 1. All right, and take a look at this. So what this basically means is what we've done is we've given the concept of a house a single weighting and the concept of red, color or whatever Midjourney understands by red, a weighting of 2, which means that it's twice as important in the prompt. And look at the results. This is a lot more creative than what we had before, and it's fundamentally different. In this, I actually don't really know what this is, but this looks like a house that's kind of coming out of the ground and out of a tree. And the top right example is just a completely different type of house. Now let's look at what happens if we turn it around and we say imagine house with a weighting of 2 and red with a weighting of 1, seed 1. So what we get this time is we still get 4 houses that are red, but you can clearly see that there's a considerably more emphasis on the house and less on the red, to the point that even in the bottom right example, we have a half red and half gray house. In the top right one, the house is sort of in the red background, but it's losing its color. So let's see what happens if we go a little bit more extreme. And this time I'm going to say imagine house 1. And this time I'm going to set the red weighting to something extreme like 4. And let's see what that gives us. Okay, so this is a bit extreme. At this point, what's happened is that we've given the house only about 20% of weighting within the overall prompt. And the other 80% goes to the color red. And Midjourney has its own ideas of what red means. And as you can see, it's completely gone off the rails and done something that has absolutely nothing to do with a house anymore, with the very small exception of the bottom left example and the top right one having like a staircase and the bottom right one being sort of like a cube. But once you hit that sort of a strength and weighting and that difference, that's where it really starts to deviate from what you actually want or what we actually have in your prompt as words. So let me show you this with a completely different example. And this time we're even going to use 3 different keywords. So I'm going to enter mountain, river, pink, seed 1, and this is without any weightings. And what Midjourney does is it puts those 3 words together as a single concept and gives us 4 landscapes of mountains with a river in them, and there's pink color all over the place. But what happens if we replace those commas and instead put weightings of 1? Imagine mountain with a weighting of 1, river with a weighting of 1, and pink with a weighting of 1. Okay, so let's open them up side by side real quick. and have a look. So this is what we had before without the weightings. This is what we get now with the weightings. Now, I understand they're clearly still landscapes, but I think we can agree that they look fundamentally different. For example, there's a lot more trees in this particular case. And here, well, I don't really know what it's doing, but it is very different. And it is a bit more creative here if you look at the top right corner one. So let's try out one more extreme case. And this time we're going to say, imagine mountain 4, river 2, and pink 1. So the emphasis is very, very strongly on the mountain. So let's have a look at what that gives us. And if we open this up, we'll see that there's considerably more emphasis this time on the mountain and on the river. Of course, there's still pink in these images, but we've told Midjourney that we want to give more importance to those other 2 elements. Now I'm going to show you one last example for these simple cases because I find this one quite illustrative. I'm going to enter house red and I'm going to add a car to our scene. And this gives us 4 images of a house that is red and even a red car in front of it. But these images in themselves are closed concepts, and that's why there's not much else going on around them. What happens if we add weightings instead? Let's go and say imagine house and give that a weighting of 1, red a weighting of 1, and car a weighting of 1. Seed 1. Let's have a look. Okay, and so even though we used almost the exact same prompt, and the only thing that we changed was that we didn't separate these keywords with commas, but we've added weightings on each one of them, we've gotten considerably more creative results. Now the one at the bottom right is fairly close still to the other ones, but the other 3 ones here that we have, obviously this is a lot more creative. This gives you a lot more ideas to work with, and that's exactly what you want to get, or maybe not. It depends on what you're trying to achieve. Now, you might be thinking that the reason why this works is because these are all just simple words that are isolated into themselves, and it's relatively easy to do that with this kind of case. And you might think that as soon as you try to use sentences, it doesn't work. Well, that's not the case. You actually can apply it to full sentences. So in this particular example that I'm going to do now, I'm going to try to build a scene that shows me a hacker that is trying to fight a tree. I know this is a fairly weird example, but I'm going to pick something quite strange because I want to show you just how well this actually works. So let's start off with the basic sentence. Imagine hacker fighting with a tree. I'm going to enter a seed of 1 and let's see what happens. Now, if we take a closer look, what you can see is that it's taken my sentence, even though it's strange, and it's looked at it as a single holistic concept. And these results are actually pretty surprisingly good. Even though the hacker isn't really fighting with the tree, it looks more like the hacker is part of the tree and he's fighting. I don't know what he's fighting, but he seems to be fighting. But let's have a look at what happens if I use text weights on this. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to separate out the hacker. I'm going to give him a weight of 1, and then fighting with a tree as an action of something that's being done is going to get also a weighting of 1, but it's a separate part of the prompt. And so let's look at what happens this time. Okay, so let me open up these images, and what you can see is that these results are considerably more creative than what we got before. And why is this? It's because Midjourney has not settled on a particular interpretation of a closed concept, but instead what it's done is it's taken our weightings on the different keywords, and then everything that's not been said explicitly, it tries to interpret and gives us different variations of what we might like. And if we look at these, well, the bottom 2 are a bit strange because these are actually trees that seem to be alive and they seem to be fighting. Then on the top right, there's one that's closer to what I actually had in mind, and that's closer to what we had before. And the top left one is completely out of whack. It looks extremely cool, but I have no idea what it was thinking. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to change our prompt and I'm going to put more emphasis on the hacker. So I'm going to give it a weighting of 2, and the fighting with a tree part, I'm only going to give a weighting of 1, and we'll see what that gives us. So by putting more weight on the hacker, what we've got is exactly what you would expect. These are up close images of what we would call a hacker, or in the other 3 of these 4 cases, what it's done is it's taken elements of a tree that I guess is kind of fighting or fighting with itself. I don't know how it's understood this text, but it's added it into the hacker. And even though it's focusing on a portrait mode of the hacker, it's sort of giving it a tree look. And the one on the top right kind of looks like Groot from Guardians of the Galaxy. At least I'm guessing that's where it's coming from. Now let's turn this around, because what we want to get is something that looks more like somebody is fighting something, in this particular case, the hacker. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to switch around the weighting. I'm going to give the hacker only a weighting of 1, and the fighting with a tree part will get a weighting of 2. And guess what? We get exactly what I wanted. So in this case, we've actually gotten 4 images that show us somebody, sometimes it's a bigger guy, sometimes it's a smaller person, who's actually trying to fight a tree. Now the tree always looks a bit different. It's actually a humanoid tree in some cases, but there's been considerably more emphasis on the second part, the fighting, the action, right? So what is actually happening in the scene. The hacker part, I'm actually not sure where it's gone. I'm sure there's some details on the guy that makes him kind of look like a hacker, but it's kind of gone away. But the point is that this is how you can actually control what your images will look like and where more emphasis will be put and where not. So what does this mean for your future prompting? Well, it clearly means that you should be using text weights considerably more than you have been so far. Just imagine how much control you can have over the final scene and the images that you're trying to create. You're no longer limited to just trying to guess something in one sentence and then packing in more and more details. Instead, you can use these weights to actually mold exactly what you want. And as an added bonus, your images are actually going to be a lot more creative than you thought was ever possible, because clearly it's delivering some things that are a lot more creative than what we got with our simple prompts that were just closed concepts. By the way, there's one more thing that I forgot to mention in this video. In every single example that I shared with you today, we used positive values for the text weights in our prompts. However, you can actually use negative values as well. To learn more about how to use negative text weights, make sure you check out this video on negative prompting. Believe it or not, but it's an essential skill for supercharging the amount of control you have over your images. So remember, have fun learning, and I'll see you next time. Cheers.